Okay, so I want to say a few words before we move on to the papers scheduled for today. My name is Jessica Valdez, as you can see on the Zoom name, and I'm an associate professor of English at the University of Hong Kong. As I said, I'm going to be recording this event, and I'll make it available later on the website that I just sent to you. This website also includes the other events in this three-part series. Now, before I begin, I just want to take a moment to remember the victims of the acts of violence and racism that were perpetrated in Atlanta this week. And I know that many of us are feeling pain, trauma, fear, and many other emotions right now. And I want to recognize that and also thank you for coming. So to begin the event, welcome to the first panel of the three-part series about Victorian Studies, Asia, and the Pacific. This panel in particular is called Intersections, Networks, and Exchanges, New Models for Victorian Studies. So in light of recent calls to undisciplined Victorian studies and widen the 19th century, I decided to organize this series of panels to think about the relationship between Victorian studies, 19th century studies, and the study of Asia and the Pacific. In a fall 2020 special issue of Victorian Studies that many of us are familiar with, called Undisciplining Victorian Studies, Chatterjee, Christoph, and Wong argue for a shift in methodology and in politics. They advocate for challenging, quote, the multiple rigidities. Actually, I've just realized I forgot to turn on the transcript. Okay, I have the live transcript on now. They advocate for challenging, quote, the multiple rigidities, cultural and conceptual, that have kept Victorian studies isolated from other fields, unquote. In light of this call, I organized a series of panels to explore the question, in what ways can an attention to scholarship on or in Asia help to undiscipline and unmake and remake Victorian studies, and also rethink the way we approach scholarly fields and field formation more generally. This panel brings together scholars whose research challenges binary approaches to Britain and the world, instead considering the triangulations, intersections, exchanges, and unmakings involved in these subjects. So we have presenters from a range of locations across the world, and I thank anyone who is joining us at an awkward time. I know this panel in particular is awkwardly timed for people in Europe. I also want to thank all the presenters and all three panels for their patience as I tried to negotiate across a number of time zones. Before we begin, I also want to thank my postgraduate, or in American terms, graduate student, Shelley Audsley, who's an MPhil or MA student with me, for all of her help. She is amazing. She designed the website and the posters and just has done so much. And she will be leaving, unfortunately for me, to pursue her PhD next year in North America. This event is also hosted by the 19th Century Research Cluster at HKU, which I also established to foster discussions across fields at the University of Hong Kong. Now, before I introduce our first speaker, I also want to plug our next event, which is April 15th. And that is at 9 p.m. in Hong Kong time and 9 a.m. in Eastern Standard Time. This time, I recognize that it will be a difficult time for people in California to attend, unfortunately. You can find more information about this coming event on the website I sent to you in the chat. So a little bit about logistics. We're going to proceed in order of the program, the randomly grouped program. I will introduce each of the speakers before their papers. Since there are 4 presenters, I've asked them to keep their papers to around 8 to 10 minutes so that we have time to transition between papers and for questions at the end. This should leave us around 30 to 40 minutes for the Q&A. And I really hope that the Q&A involves not just questions, but also comments and real discussion. And I will warn the presenters with a private Zoom chat when they're around 8 minutes. And please feel free to type questions or comments as they come to you in the text box. I've asked the presenters not to look at the text box while they're presenting because I don't want them to be distracted, but I'll keep an eye on what's going on there. And you can even use it for a side conversation like our students do. I will ask any text questions after the talk. And also, of course, after the talks, I'll open it up to audio or video questions. So we'll start with the first speaker, who conveniently is on my screen right now. And I will first give her co-host rights. Just a moment. Okay, so she's now co-host and can share whatever she wants to share. And I'll introduce her. Jacqueline Barrios is a PhD candidate at UCLA's Department of English, studying London and 19th century British and American literature. Her current project investigates London Pacific trans-urban imaginaries, geographies of East Asian Pacific Rim entanglement with the British capital. She is a member of UCLA's Urban Humanities Initiative, a research program linking architecture, urban planning, and humanities scholars on city-based inquiry. She connects her research to her other role as a veteran public school teacher in South Los Angeles, for whom she directs Lit Labs, fusing visual performing arts and public humanities to imagine new pedagogy for the 21st century urban teen reader of the 19th century novel. Okay, so I'll hand it over to Jacqueline.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, everyone. Since we have a tight schedule, I'm just going to get started. My talk today, and am I good with sound? Okay, my talk today, Treaty Portal, Wuhan in 3 acts, springs from my dissertation, London's Pacific Rim, which explores the ways the global city is open to flows of labor and capital by connecting the 19th century London to the Pacific Rim. While London's imperial zones have long been imagined primarily, sometimes even almost exclusively, in relation to the Indian subcontinent and the British West Indies, I examine its less elaborated connections to East Asia. In so doing, I reveal the surprising ways the metropole has indissoluble connections to the Pacific Rim and might, in fact, be imagined as a Pacific Rim city itself. While this is hinted most infamously in the Victorian imaginary through the space of the Opium Den, the full story of London's East Asian entanglements, however, has yet to be told. With the Opium Wars 1839 through 1860 as marking seminal historical moments, the project forges what I call a London counter-imaginary, scavenging archival objects that attest to East Asian presences in these locales of cross-cultural life. And I've identified these locales as focus places in the project: the East India Company merchant ship, the boarding house, the treaty port, and the internment camp. Act 1, Portals. The title of this print arrests my attention. I am the door. Circa 1930, this is one of 6 posters published by the Religious Tract Society of China, part of their annual Week of Evangelism that coincided with Chinese celebrations for the New Year.
Jacqueline, are you there? You've frozen? We'll wait a minute for Jacqueline to come back. Oh no, we lost her. Why don't we wait a minute or two and see if she comes back? If she doesn't, we'll start with the next one and then we'll move into hers when she's able to come back. Oh, she's back again. Great. Oh, don't we love Zoom?
I'm going to chalk that up to the topic of my talk. Confused portals. Does my time start again? Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
It can start again, don't worry.
All right, I think I froze right with Act 1, if that's correct. Okay.
Yeah, we got to the beginning of Act 1.
Okay, Act 1. Here we go. I'm on hotspot now, just to, okay, hold on one second. Okay, Act 1, Portals. The title of this print arrests my attention. I Am the Door. Circa 1930, this is one of 6 posters published by the Religious Tract Society of China, part of their annual Week of Evangelism that coincided with Chinese celebrations for the New Year. Featuring text both in Chinese and Arabic, the poster was likely produced, quote, for the benefit of the Chinese Muslim community primarily concentrated in the northwest of the country. Printed in the style of calligraphy scrolls, the poster functions as an uncanny print portal, a permeable artifact of promiscuous traffic and a co-optation of messaging between print and image, between religion and imperialism, and for the British evangelism between this fallen world and the eternal next. This poster was also designed and printed in Hankou, one of the 3 cities at the confluence of the Han and Yangtze rivers that is present-day Wuhan. As treaty port historian Robert Bickers has reminded us, Wuhan is not an unknown place. It is not beyond our knowledge. It has long been a part of British lives and many others overseas, intimately so, if unobtrusively. As portal to and from Wuhan's material history, this particular door raises intellectual, ethical, and imaginative questions about the reasons and ramifications for the way Wuhan is not an unknown place. Attempt reading of the poster means to invite interpretive protocols to collide or align scriptural exegesis and Chinese calligraphic conventions organize the visual field. In the middle, a slightly deranged enclosure rearranges brick and script. Arabic and Chinese gates bid the viewer not only enter, but float into an expansive space of mountain and sky and sunlight beyond. Yet, this free-for-all in some ways dead ends upon itself. The media history of treaty port visual evangelism leaves us not with the keys to the kingdom, but rather insight about the ever more important enterprise of printing visual culture to legitimate and fund missionary work in Hankou. This doorway, I suggest, is better read for what literary critic Nanda has called the intransitivity of transnational counters. In accounting for shallow, frivolous, or absent exchange, Nanda has opened up new avenues for attending to cross-cultural contact, calling into question in doing so the hermeneutic desire itself for hybridity and interconnection to drive the study of transnational collisions and juxtapositions. This is a doorway, in fact, that refuses entry, even as it invites it. Its translations enabling conquest, its equivalences summoning conversion. Act 2, Treaty. Lawful Christian evangelism, in fact, entered China via the legal portal of the treaty. After the defeat of Chinese forces by British-led military engagements in the Opium Wars, the 1858 Treaty of Tianjin, here excerpted, extended British wins from the 1842 Treaty of Nanjing, adding additional ports, including Hankou, and permitted the proselytizing of the Christian religion. As the much-hated unequal treaties, these documents, in fact, thwart cross-cultural exchange, augmenting British self-understanding at the expense of constraining Chinese sovereignty. The Treaty of Tianjin especially did so, as comparative literature scholar and theorist Lydia Liu has argued, by the inclusion of Article 50 and 51 here highlighted. Article 50, in the event of there being any difference of meaning between the English and Chinese text, the English government will hold the sense as expressed in the English text to be the correct sense. Article 51, it is agreed that henceforward the character ye, barbarian, shall not be applied to the government or subjects of Her Britannic Majesty in any Chinese official document issued by the Chinese authorities either in the capital or in the province. In the above articles, the linguistic priority of English works to corroborate British claims of injury. According to Liu, both Chinese and earlier British translators had previously glossed ye as actually the less derogatory and neutral foreigner. Yet all meanings were extinguished in order for the British to have literally the final word. Nursing a sensitivity to matters of honor since the much publicized Koto demand imposed on the Macartney mission of 1793, British diplomatic actions accomplished their aims under the moral guise of seeking redress for China's injury to British notions of honor and fair play. And this matters if we are to understand treaty portals as the spatial reference of these erratic documents of international law. Treaty ports were not only systems to manage the flow of foreign material and bodies in Chinese territory, but were the, quote, sorrowful foreign concessions, end quote, that continue to harbor unresolved antagonisms that, as we now see, had been coded within the text of the treaty itself. Act 3, Wuhan. What might it mean to recall this moment of linguistic tension today, given the global media coverage of lockdown when COVID-19 struck in January 2020? In an analysis of pandemic online diaries, Guo Binyang writes, no other city in China or the world was sealed off as abruptly, decisively, and tightly as Wuhan. Planes, trains, ships, and 11 million bodies, all detained in a collective suspended animation that shocked the world. Wuhan Diary, Dispatches from a Quarantined City by Chinese novelist Fang Fang, became one of the most important conduits managing this unsettling desire to peer into the mirror and future of our quarantine life. Daily posts on Weibo and WeChat peaked in April at 380 million views, 94,000 discussions, and 8,000 original posts, and an English translation out by the summer. In reading the memoir, the increasing drama between Fang Fang and her censors, who accuse her of rumor mongering and pandering to the West, drives the form of the diary. The author's record of Wuhan's communal will to survive, evade, and cope with the virus is intertwined with what I see as the diary's own tactics to evade and survive its own deletion. The way the Western media canonizes Fang Fang as the lone voice of conscience at war with her censors in some ways actually works to mute the long history behind this compulsion to know Wuhan, to be granted access, in fact, to the inner lives of its people. In this way, Wuhan Diary is a 2021 treaty portal, an artifact that stages an opening to recognize logics endemic to the 19th century formation of extraterritorial space in Chinese soil. Here again is a doorway both inviting and disordering entry, access, understanding. The Wuhan lockdown, as an enclosure of unprecedented magnitude, plays upon Western anxieties about an uncannily familiar and newly threatening porosity between China and the West. In one sense, the irony is a crude reversal, a 19th century Western drive to open portals in Chinese space, haunting its inability to close them in the 21st. Doors, after all, open and shut both ways. In another sense, Wuhan's quarantine brings the geographic heuristic of treaty ports into play, spaces to understand the entangled history that manufacture and reproduce the fear and fascination within situations of cross-cultural impasse. In conclusion, in this paper, I have scavenged locally intimate, yet historically distant artifacts to construct a trans-temporal imaginary of the treaty port. By excavating and arranging these as relational objects, I offer a methodology for perceiving the ways their histories continue to structure our imaginations of cross-cultural space. As treaty portals, they render the historical specificity of the 19th century treaty port immanent with the disconnection and desires of our time. I have some open-ended questions that I feel emerge from this micro-performance of the methodology behind London's Pacific Rim that perhaps we can return to at the end during Q&A. First, how can undisciplined methods of scavenging, curation, assembly, etc., help us not only form but read a decentered 19th century archive? Second, how should present day global emergencies inform the work of conceiving 19th century global imaginaries? And thirdly, what can 19th century cross-cultural space teach us about community formation today, both within and through our work as scholars? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I love those final questions as well. And I hope we can discuss at least some of them during the Q&A. So now I'm going to change who has the sharing rights. And I'll give it to Victor. Where is Victor on my list? There he is. Okay, Victor is now the co-host. I also have Victor's PowerPoint in case we do have some problems. So I'll introduce Victor. Victor is finishing a doctorate degree in epistemology and history of science at the University of Strasbourg, France. His research interests include the depiction of extinct animals in deep past environments, since the 19th century, the global history of paleontology and dinosaurs in popular culture. While working on his dissertation remotely, he is teaching French language and literature in Newport Beach, California. So I'll hand it over to Victor.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm gonna share my PowerPoint right now. I hope this works for everyone. All right, perfect. Well, first, again, I'd like to thank you, Jessica, for organizing this event and thank everyone involved in it and for giving me the chance to share some of my research with you today. I hope that by offering a different perspective on the history of one of the most prominent 19th century science in Great Britain, namely paleontology, I hope to effectively contribute to the main objective of this series of roundtable. And because I do not claim to have any expertise in the field of Victorian studies in particular, I'm looking forward to your comments and suggestions afterwards. So, Hunting the Moa, Paleontology, Cannibalism, and Deep Time Politics in New Zealand, Great Britain, and Madagascar, 1840-1890. In this presentation, I propose to highlight the political implications of paleontological discoveries made in the colonies. To do so, I'm focusing on how certain fossil specimens acquired scientific, symbolic, and political meanings through exchanges occurring not only between the metropole and the periphery, but also between peripheries themselves. The discussions will be centered around the discovery of giant birds' remains in the colony of New Zealand and how these bones were to play a crucial role, first, on how Maori people would be represented by European colonists as cannibals on the verge of extinction, and secondly, on how New Zealand would try to present itself in competition with other colonies, such as Madagascar, as a more attractive destination for prospective immigrants and investments. Our story begins in 1839, when fragments of giant bones were brought back to Great Britain from New Zealand. The bones were eventually given to the anatomist Richard Owen, who published a paper the same year on them, claiming that they belong to a giant species of bird resembling the ostrich, and that the Maori were calling moa. The article encouraged the search for more remains, or even for a potential living specimen. To quote Owen, the present notice, it is hoped, may tend to accelerate its discovery, if it be still in being, or may stimulate to the collection of the remaining parts of the skeleton, if the specimens no longer exist. End quote. The call to look for the remains of a mysterious animal aligned here perfectly with the call for exploration and further colonial expansion. Further discoveries of similar bones in the early 1840s allowed Owen to confirm his first deductions in a memoir published in 1844. Owen's success had actually two major implications. The first implication is that it exemplified the power of reason. It confirmed the superiority of European men and of their scientific powers, allowing them here, in the case of paleontology in particular, to bring back to life what had died and to create order out of fragments. Indeed, we can read in Owen's publication in 1844, which was then republished in 1879, quote, "The positive facts justified the attempt to restore and, as it were, to present a living portrait of the long-lost Dinornis. And without giving the rein to a too exuberant fancy, we may take a retrospective glance at the scene of a fair island, offering by the will of a bountiful providence a well-spread table to a race of animated beings particularly adapted to enjoy it. And we may recall the time when the several species of Dinornis ranged the lords of its soil, the highest living forms upon that part of the earth." End quote. Reconstituted by the power of paleontological reasoning, the moa, or Dinornis, as Owen would call it, became a symbol of New Zealand's lost age of abundance, which the European colonists were planning to restore. Paleontology here contributed to an ecological narrative demonstrating the virtues of colonialism. The confirmation of Owen's prediction had a second consequence. If it reaffirmed the belief in the intellectual superiority of European men, it also, in perfect opposition, provided ground for the portrayal of Maori people and their ancestors as spoilers of nature's bounty in need of education and redemption. It provided an apparently logical explanation for the cannibal practices observed, greatly misunderstood and exaggerated by the colonists. In his 1844 memoir, again, Owen suggests that the Moa were drove to extinction by the Maori excessive hunting. He wrote that when the source of animal food from terrestrial species was reduced by the total extirpation of the genus Dinornis to this low point, then may have arisen those cannibal practices which until lately formed the opprobrium of a race of men in all other respects much superior to the Papuan Aborigines, end quote. This theory would become widely popular in Great Britain and New Zealand and echoed in many newspapers for decades. So from the mid-1840s, the Moa's fossil remains became, on the one hand, symbols of European civilizing powers, and on the other hand, forensic evidence of Maori's fall into cannibalism. The Moa's fossils provided material proof to strengthen racial hierarchies and to justify colonial endeavors in New Zealand. These three images I'm showing here, I think, constitute a great opportunity to see how the Moa served both to celebrate the European men and to diminish the Maori people. The two illustrations on the left are from the same book, published in the 1870s by New Zealander ornithologist Walter Buller. If the author here claims to use both images simply for the sake of illustrating the incredible size of certain species of Moa, the framing and composition of each image reveal another layer of signification. The white man on the right is compared to a single leg, which, if it demonstrates the great size of the animal, still allows the European character to remain relatively at the same level. He is holding the leg as a sort of staff and has one hand in his pocket. His whole posture demonstrates a sort of confidence and control, which clearly we do not see in the image showing a Maori chief facing here a complete skeleton of Moa. The Maori, on the other hand, appears as a child in comparison, completely disconnected to the Moa, not even looking at it. He does not own it like the European man does. On the contrary, he appears as just another natural specimen, a representative of an extinct species himself. The photograph on the right, taken in 1877, is of Richard Owen himself, in front of a partially reconstituted skeleton of Dinornis. The key detail in this image, and I'm not sure if you could see, but is that Owen is holding a bone fragment in his right hand while touching the skeleton with his left hand. Owen is actually here portrayed as the link between the fragment and the skeleton as a whole. He intellectually fathered the Dinornis. The photograph does not serve to illustrate a size difference here, but instead highlights the powers of European reasoning expressed in Owen's prediction. Because the Moa came to play such a crucial role symbolically and politically, the discovery in Madagascar in the 1850s of a larger fossil species of giant birds and its identification by French anatomist Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire prompted a quick response to intensively collect Moa's remains in New Zealand. As early as 1853, the contributor to a local newspaper admitted that, and I'm quoting here, did not feel altogether satisfied at the manner in which this new discovery throws our own Moa into the shade, end quote. He proceeded by sharing his recent discoveries of Moa's remains, claiming that they were restoring the Moa as the largest species of flightless bird that ever existed. This example shows how Moa's fossil contributed not only to define racial differences within the colony, but also provided New Zealand with an argument to claim its place in the global arena. New Zealand took the habit of exhibiting skeletons of Dinornis in various colonial exhibitions across Europe. Fossils of giant species like the moa were a valuable commodity a colony could use to distinguish itself from others and to advertise itself as a land of wonders to prospective immigrants. So I hope I provided enough information and context for you to see how following the circulation and interpretation of fossil remains can maybe help us to decentralize not only the history of British colonialism, but also the history of sciences, and especially paleontology in that case. I'm handing my presentation here to give as much time as possible for a potential question. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. And we'll continue moving on and do the questions at the end. So the next one is Menglu Gao. I'm going to make her a co-host as well, and then I'll introduce her. She is a Buffett Global Impacts Graduate Fellow and PhD candidate in Comparative Literary Studies in English at Northwestern University. She specializes in 19th century British literature with research interests in medical humanities, empire studies, critical theory, and Anglo-Chinese transnational studies. She is the recipient of prizes and fellowships from, among others, the Midwestern Victorian Studies Association, the Consortium for History of Science, Technology and Medicine, and Northwestern's Paris program in critical theory. Her current project, The Lacquered Chinese Box, Opium, Addiction, and the Fantasy of Empire in 19th century British Literature, examines how medical theories provided new ways for British authors to imagine the nation's rapidly expanding empire relative to its Chinese counterpoint. So I will hand it over to her now.
Thanks, Jessica. Can you all see the slides right now? Okay, yes. So I will just briefly talk about how the medical idea of intoxication helped to frame the divergence between China and Britain around the First Opium War. And more generally, I hope this case study can help us think about the intersection of science or medicine, literature, and imperial politics in the 19th century. So this is a picture showing the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. In 1842, at the end of the 3-year war with China over opium, Britain sealed its military victory with this treaty. The treaty justified Britain's territorial expansion, its possession of a new colony, the Hong Kong Island, as a commercial need. According to Article 3 of the treaty, it is, quote, obviously necessary and desirable that British subjects should have some port whereat they may careen and refit their ships when required and keep stores for that purpose. The inter-imperial conflict around this war was perhaps best encapsulated by the different ways the two parties talk about opium. Britain claimed that it fought for opium, an important commodity of global trade that symbolized greater rapidity in circulation and transportation following the Industrial Revolution. For China, on the contrary, opium was a foreign poison leading to national regress. To cite a placard in the streets of Canton before the war, opium was, quote, a life-destroying drug whose baneful influence seems to threaten little by little to degrade the whole population of the Celestial Empire to a level with reptiles, beasts, dogs, and swine. So with this simplified version of the contrast between national regress and the so-called progressive free trade in mind, let us look at a similar pair of opium's connotations relevant to temporality in a medical context a couple of decades ago, that is opium's intoxicating effects. The Scottish physician and philosopher Robert Macnish, for example, discusses sleep, dreaming, and intoxication in his Philosophy of Sleep and Anatomy of Drunkenness. The two treatises were extremely popular and influential in Britain in the 1820s and 1830s. Macnish categorizes opium as an intoxicating agent that can result in two opposite states of mind. On the one hand, it can induce more hallucinations. In this case, quote, the imagination is expanded and filled with 1,000 delightful images. On the other hand, the intoxicating state more often prevents dreaming, leading to the loss of sense and consciousness. So according to the theory of intoxication, opium can create an alternative temporality in which psychical time is either prolonged if you have hallucinations or condensed if you have a profound slumber without dreams. So here is a quote from McNish. He says, time seems to be in a great measure annihilated. An extensive period is reduced, as it were, to a single point, or rather, a single point is made to embrace an extensive period. The point I want to make here is that an alternative opium-induced temporality as an expansion or condensation of time informed visions of a speedy, advanced British Empire in 19th century travel narratives. This imagination depends on a temporal and cultural counterexample, the stagnation and intoxication of another place or empire. So the example of travel narratives I'm focusing on here is Charles Gutzlaff's 1834 Journal of 3 Voyages along the coast of China. Gutzlaff was actually born in Prussia, but he had more publications in English than in his native German. Like his other English works, this travelogue was published in London under his anglicized name, Charles Gutzlaff, instead of his original name, Karl Gutzlaff. The narrator of this journal identifies himself as an Englishman and one of, quote, our English sailors. And Britain is the only country with which he compares everything he encounters in Asia or China. So as its title suggests, Journal of 3 Voyages incorporates 3 independent trips narrated in the first person. In the first voyage, the narrator travels in a Chinese junk that departs from Thailand. It sails along the entire coast of China to the northern port Tianjin, and then returns to the Portuguese colony of Macau. The second voyage takes place in the British East Indian Company's ship, Lord Amherst, that departs from and finally returns to Macau. And the last one is on the British Trading Company Jardin's ship, Sylph, from Canton to China's northern ports. The narrator Gutzlaff, as an amateur doctor familiar with medical discussions of intoxication, sometimes practices curing the habit of opium smoking during his voyages. At the same time, however, the actual Gutzlaff was an active participant in Britain's opium trade and the later Opium War. As a multilingual missionary, he served as English-Chinese interpreter for British commanders and negotiators during the First Opium War, as well as for the expeditions of British trading companies before the war in the early 1830s. The last 2 voyages in this journal are actually the 2 of these expeditions. The task of these expeditions, though not mentioned in the travelogue, was to find more trade opportunities, including the opium market along the coast of China. While Gutzlaff treated habitual Chinese opium users, he also played an important role, ironically, in helping opium traders to enter the country. In fact, the narrator claims in the journal that the Chinese government's interference in free trade hurts both Britain and the Chinese, since there is a great but unmet demand for European goods in this country. Since its publication, Journal of 3 Voyages had been immediately used by people such as H. Lyman and John Barrow as proof of the Chinese people's desire to open up culturally and to engage more freely in international trade. The narrator frequently calls for China's trade with Britain, arguing that it will accelerate. That's exactly the word he uses. It will accelerate China's progress and bring about additional benefits. He specifically mentions the quote-unquote stagnation of opium trade as one of the bad consequences of the country's severe prohibitions. Merchants had been arrested. There are large quantities of the drug no longer available to people in need of it. Interestingly, the narrator hates the actual opium use during his voyages, in which every Chinese sailor is smoking opium anytime and everywhere. So I just want to note here that taking opium is actually not a particular Chinese habit. We can see in contemporaneous British medical treatises and travelogues that opium intoxication is actually a common practice for sailors to counterbalance the tedious voyage by changing their sense of time on board. If the effects of intoxication is simply the expansion of time in one's hallucinations, it is probably more attractive than what a traveler can see and hear in the real world on the sea. And if the effect turns out to be, or finally becomes a loss of consciousness, opium can successfully shorten the seemingly endless voyage in one's perception. That said, the representation of intoxication from the substance user's perspective can often be used as an effective device to accelerate narrative speed. For example, the narrative can directly switch to a faraway location as the intoxicated person wakes up. In Journal of Three Voyages, however, opium intoxication has a completely different function. With the narrator being the only sober person, other people's repetitive opium use has become an element that haunts the trip, just like the constant movement of water and the potentially everlasting stillness of the sky that traps the viewer at sea. In this special environment, the narrator is always measuring time and calculating the days between two locations in his journal, trying to push the Chinese sailors to move forward. However, the sailors are described as simply using opium to maintain their stagnant state at sea, to stay forever in the present, and to postpone arriving at their destinations. So this contrast between mobility and the ship's procrastination also appears in the narrator's judgment about China as an empire. In a debate about their current ship, the Chinese sailors' habits and the Chinese empire, the narrator says to the sailors, reform or you are lost. So what gets lost and needs to be reformed here could be either this specific ship or this old empire. As he puts it, like the ship, China is in one of progress and is perhaps even deteriorating, quote, doomed to perpetual seclusion from the world. The Chinese seaman's intoxication symbolizes the very opposite of national progress. Similarly, the English traveler's vulnerability in front of the stagnant trip and empire is communicated by his encounter with an opium-induced alternative temporality. By presenting this encounter, the travelogue provides a kind of counterexample China for British authors and readers, including the later mid-century liberalism, to position progressiveness within an international frame of reference. So I just want to end this presentation with John Stuart Mill's use of China in his later conceptualization of progress. So instead of clarifying what it means by human progressiveness, Mill actually introduces a warning example in China. They have become stationary, and unless individuality shall be able successfully to assert itself against this yoke, Europe will tend to become another China. So that's it, and I look forward to talk more about the topic, and I also look forward to our next presentation and our later discussions.
Thank you so much. Last talk for today. I'm going to share. Okay. All right, the last speaker for today is Tomoe Kumojima, who is a lecturer at the Core of STEM and the International Exchange Center at Nara Women's University in Japan. She just came back to Japan, in fact, is in home quarantine, she mentioned, after completing a year as a visiting scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, on the Fulbright Research Scholar Program. Her forthcoming book, based on her PhD thesis, is on writings by Victorian female travelers to Meiji Japan and the ethical possibility of female transnational friendship. Her current research project explores the concept of aesthetic diplomacy and its political efficacy through textual and visual analysis of travelogues, fictional writing, and artwork about Japan by women in both the British Empire and the United States in the tumultuous time of the early 20th century. Her publications include A Strange Thrill, Isabella Bird and the Fugitive Community of Travelers in Studies in Travel Writing, and The Democracy of Art, Elizabeth Keith and the Aesthetic of the Eastern Ordinary in Literature, Memory, and Hegemony, East-West Crossings. So I will give it over to Tomoe now.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for the introduction and also organizing this wonderful panel. And I also want to thank all of my co-panelists for fascinating talks. I've already learned a lot, I feel, and thanks to everyone else for coming today. As the time is tight, I'm just diving in. Okay, as Jessica mentioned, I'm in self-quarantine at the moment, and I'm using this thing called pocket Wi-Fi, and I don't really trust my internet connections. I didn't really, I didn't prepare any fancy presentation. I'm really sorry. I hope I don't bore you. Anyways, the decade around the turn of the 20th century marked a dramatic shift in the Anglo-Japanese relation. Japan began to emerge as a new world power after its victory in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95, and entered into a fierce rivalry with Russia over territorial claims in China. Britain, on the other hand, was increasingly vigilant of Russian expansionism in the Far East, hence in need of an ally in the East. Following their joint action to suppress the anti-Western Boxer Rebellion in 1900, the two island empires signed the Anglo-Japanese Alliance in 1902. And under this alliance, Japan waged the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-05. This relational shift is epitomized by a small but significant addition to the 1900 edition of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella Bird, arguably the best known traveler by a Victorian female traveler to Japan. The new edition has the inscription, Dai Nippon Banzai, Great Japan Forever, on its title page. Mary Crawford Fraser, the focus of my paper today, was the wife of Hugh Fraser, a British diplomat in Tokyo between 1889 and 1894. Fraser published a succession of her numerous Japanese-related fictional and journalistic works from 1898 to 1908. Overviewing her literary publications, theatre production, and published correspondence with Japanese statesmen, I will discuss how they served para-diplomatic purposes by contributing to create pro-Japanese sentiments among the Victorian leadership on both sides of the Atlantic. I will argue that some Victorian women's travel writing about Japan presents a model of affective relationality between the British Empire and the putative East, refreshingly different from the old Orientalist binary model or the antagonistic model of competing empires and threats more recently presented by Grace Lavery and Ross Forman. It was Fraser's explicitly stated desire, quote, to bring Japan a little nearer to the understanding and sympathy of today's England, end of quote, as she declares in the introduction of A Diplomatist's Wife in Japan, Letters from Home to Home, published in 1898. We can consider her writing to be her literary alternative to her husband's diplomatic work. It was during his service that the renegotiation of the unequal treaties between the two empires gained impetus, and it was on 16th of July, 1894, a month after his premature death in Tokyo, that the revised Anglo-Japanese commercial treaty was signed that removed extraterritoriality and recovered tariff autonomy to Japan. As a literary diplomat, Fraser presents the two empires on a par as twin brothers in the epigraphic poem and unites the two peoples in the emotional realm of sympathy. Fraser explains the moment of true bonding with Japanese people as follows, quote, and the people have the same way of wrapping themselves in colorless conventionalities. That which you expect from them is that which they would wish to show you, and very likely all that you will ever see. But if any shared emotion suddenly draws you closer together, Then the valleys rent away. You behold the springs of action, and lo, there are those which have swayed you in the best moments of your life. And if you are honest and humble-minded, you will say in your heart, brother, I misjudged thee. Perhaps thou art near to wisdom and to love as I. End of quote. Fraser singles out that, quote, shared emotion, end of quote, as a key to deeper mutual understanding beyond an outward display of courtesy. And she advises Victorian readers to relinquish imperial conceit for the genuine cross-cultural encounter. This emotional parity marks a fundamental shift from the first British diplomatic representative in Japan, Rutherford Alcott's narrative, which claims that, quote, the touch of sympathy which makes the whole world kin is wanting between Britain and Japan, end of quote. Fraser's travelogue offers real-life accounts of what Audrey Jaffe termed, quote, scenes of sympathy, end of quote, such as heightened emotional moments of deathbed and funeral scenes. However, while Jaffe characterizes Victorian identification with others as ultimately, quote, sympathy with the self, end of quote, Fraser's cross-cultural sympathy does not draw the circle of self-sameness. Instead, it opens up to Japanese friends, suspending judgment by vision, and instead listening to their stories. Besides her travelogue, Fraser published 3 novels and 2 collections of short stories with Japanese motifs, where she further explores the interiority of her cultural others. Fraser's travelogue was retitled and published in the United States as Letters from Japan, a record of modern life in the Island Empire. The alteration of the subtitle from Letters from Home to Home, which indicates equivalence and affinity, to a record of modern life in the Island Empire, suggests not only ethnographic objectivity, but also emotional distance the American publisher, or the American readership by extension, might have perceived towards Japan. After all, Japan wasn't America's ally. Fraser's cosmopolitan background, however, complicates this narrative. Fraser was born in Italy into a renowned American family, and her letters were sent from Japan to southern Italy, where her brother lived. In this sense, her idea of home was significantly fluid. In fact, Fraser was back in the United States when the Russo-Japanese War broke out, and she endeavored to bring the United States and Japan together. Fraser organized a charity stage, The Stolen Prince, for Japanese war widows and orphans at the Belasco Theater in New York on the 12th of May, 1905. Fraser versified her novel, The Stolen Emperor, and the story was told in living pictures by a mixed cast of Americans and Japanese expatriates under the patronage of both Americans and Japanese. In the summer, Fraser was sent to Tokyo by the New York Times on a mission to report on the country in the war. Although the peace treaty was concluded before her arrival, her articles about Japan appeared regularly in the newspaper as well as the US magazine, The World's Work. Her advocacy of Japan through these media outlets were intended to neutralize public opinion counter to the sharp rise of anti-Japanese sentiments in the United States after Japan's victory in the Russo-Japanese War and hostile media coverage. Finally, Fraser's unpublished letters to Privy Councillor Nagasaki Shogo and the Lord Steward to the Empress Kagawa Keizo in 1906 and 1907 revealed that Fraser was engaged to serve the Japanese Empress from November in 1906, although this plan never materialized due to her health problem. Though I'm not going into details today, it is important to note that there were Fraser's friendships with Japanese upper-class women and a trans-Pacific female network behind her paradiplomatic efforts. So to conclude, literature and journalistic writing provided Fraser with a safe medium to negotiate patriarchal restrictions and exercise diplomatic agency. Reading Victorian women's travel writing about Japan as Britain's ally sheds fresh light on the Victorian discourse on the putative East and cultural others, and contributes to discussions on multifaceted possibilities of cross-cultural and inter-imperial relations. It also illuminates the political agency of Victorian women on the diplomatic arena and fills a huge gap in the androcentric historiography of Trans-Pacific cultural diplomacy presented by such historians as Akira and Michael A. Oswin. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much. I guess we'll kind of clap for everyone. So that is the final paper. All four papers, which is fabulous. And I think there's a lot of intersections that we can engage with. First, before I open it up to audio and video questions, I see that Jessica Medhurst has a question in the text chat, specifically for Jacqueline. So I'll ask that first. Jessica wrote, "Wonderful paper. Thank you, Jacqueline. I'm especially interested in what you say about finding your scavenged items and how they can be understood as an archive of their own." Can you say a little bit about that, Jacqueline?
Oh, sure. First of all, thank you for the comment, and also for, in some ways, clarifying, I think, what scavenging does, as opposed to other words that we can use for assembling or collecting or curating objects of study. It's coming out of actually studying mudlarks and Mayhew as a Victorianist and kind of looking at literal scavengers in 19th century London space. And from there, kind of also having an interest in Walter Benjamin's kind of idea of the rag picker and how the Arcades Project as a kind of as a form of assembling lots of little bits and pieces of lost fragments of space in order to understand a whole. So in some ways, scavenging works for me because, and scholars have actually written about this, about scavenging. Zachary Samelin has an article on scavenger hermeneutics that is as a uniquely 19th century way of gathering knowledge but maybe pushing against the Victorian taxonomic drive with maybe an alternative way of thinking about assembling things that are actually lost, deemed unvaluable, and reanimating that with value through the act of recovery. And there's a certain kind of contingency to that I feel informs how I put together my objects. And I think it's also about space, and part of scavenging is about, you have to be in a certain kind of what's organizing, I guess, my principle of selection is a treaty port, an actual space. And so I think that binds the method as I see it in terms of like putting things together. But more to think about, I would say. I would love to hear what people's thoughts are around scavenging.
Thanks. And I hope that we can continue to talk about that. But first, let me see if there's any questions from the panel members or the audience. I see there's a question in the text chat. Thank you all panelists for sharing your interesting papers. I have a broad question for the panelists. Would you tell a bit more in which sense your project presents a new model for Victorian studies, particularly for Victorianists in North America and the UK? So it's for everyone. So whoever wants to kind of pop in. I know Victor said he doesn't necessarily identify himself as a Victorianist, which is fine. I mean, we're looking to unmake and rethink what Victorian studies means, but I'll kind of leave it open to who wants to jump on that question first.
Maybe if the least qualified can start. To me, what's my research, what's interesting is to take try to take a narrative that's already pretty settled in regards to the history of science, the history of paleontology, which is very much a history that is still characterized by a sense of wonder, a sense of manifest destiny in a way, the discovery of deep time, the discovery of all these dead species and their reconstruction. So taking this narrative and to continue on Jacqueline's point of scavenging, it's very much just kind of taking one fragment and following that fragment along and disrupting this massive narrative. So it comes out of knowing this bibliography, but at the same time, not having as much knowledge as the people who built that huge historiography I'm actually relying on and comparing my own research to it. But just being this, I like this image of the scavenger because I feel like that sometimes, just scavenging the net, the internet, or looking for these images and following them along. The case, for example, of Buller's illustrations was really much me trying to go through the internet and trying to find the first images, the first version of the Dinornis, and then maybe the image of the Maori that was then transplanted to it, like trying to just piece out together these things and disrupt a huge narrative already well settled. I think that's not as much the constructive phase as it's more like the destructive phase in a way. I'm not yet in rebuilding maybe another narrative or more dimensional narrative, but I would say it is about just following this little lead, maybe an object, or as I'm sure, I hope I'm saying it right, Menglu proposed, like following maybe just the way an experience is described, the opium, like how is it described and how does it translate in different circumstances. That's the kind of similarities I'm seeing between all of our papers.
Yeah, I guess I can jump in because Victor just mentioned my paper. Yeah, so I think first of all, I'm interested in the ways that like we can find a parallel between the individual body and the imperial body, or the idea of the empire, by thinking about the connection between medicine and literature. And I think that topic was already very, very popular in Victorian studies, but what I want to do in my research is to add this transnational dimension to that. But I think following that, I think more importantly, I don't want to say that I provide a new model, but I would say that I'm actually following the model already existing in post-colonial studies to think about the importance of the non-West to the formation or the self-making of 19th century Britain. Because we don't want to think of like this glorious Victorian period as a presumed status, or this kind of like pre-existing victory of the British Empire. But actually in 19th century, the empire has clashes with different empires, like Asian empires, or even Russia or Ottoman Empire. So it has a very transnational dimension in the 19th century. So partially by thinking about a connection between Victorian studies in Asia, as well as Victorian studies in Pacific, sort of help us to think about this inter-imperial or transnational context of the British Empire. And I think, for example, if we think about John Stomue's discussion of the stagnation of China, or the stagnation of the East, we can actually think about like how the empire was actually building its supremacy based on its this sort of comparison with other parts of the world. So I would say that's sort of a kind of transnational model, but I don't think it's anything fresh new. But I think like all the panelists were just showing us like a different way of thinking about this transnational contacts or connections.
I think I'll jump in. As Menglu just mentioned, I think my contribution to this field is the different models of different way of thinking about transnationality. Especially my field is Japan, and Japan wasn't a British colony in a strict sense, and it has quite different history compared with other Asian countries. Like it became imperialistic nation itself and invaded many Asian countries, including China and Korea. And so thinking about Japan in post-colonial studies or Victorian studies gives a completely different way of looking at East, putative East. And also my way of looking at travel writing about Japan by British female travelers is I'm focusing on more of affective bonding rather than competing empires. And I want to, by looking at friendships and personal relationships, with actual relationships, human relationships between British women and Japanese women or Japanese people, I want to look at the different way of different possibilities of cross-cultural relationships, and also kind of the possibility of alliance across nations. And another thing is I'm looking at the political female role in diplomatic arena, and that research into that female role in diplomatic arena hasn't been really done yet. So and also and I think that's my contribution.
Thanks. I think that, does anyone else want to say anything about that question before we move on? Just to say a couple of words, I do think it's interesting the different and also intertwined methodologies that we're seeing at play here. So of course we have the inter-imperial approach, thinking about competing empires. We also have this move towards scavenging and excavation. And of course, Victor himself is critiquing the practices of excavation in the 19th century as well. And then Tomoe at the end has a very different approach in terms of affective relations, thinking about diplomatic relations and transnational relations through affect or through sympathy. Very different approaches, but I think really useful to think of them in relationship to each other. I also see, we have a few comments in the text. Julia, do you have a question, or is that just a comment for the text?
It's really just a comment. I'm thinking out aloud, you know, following up on Jung Kyung's question about how we are undisciplining. I think you are all undisciplining, and I was just thinking through it. Something that, you know, I'm still working through, and I wonder whether anybody has a comment, is whether, you know, how we really deal with grand narratives now. You know, we've had this longue durée in a way. You know, in Jacqueline's paper, we've got Victor, who's dealing with large spans of time. You know, by definition, we've had the presentism comment already addressed. So I'm wondering, you know, whether this clearly is the end of grand narratives, and how undisciplining Victorian studies fits into these spatialities and temporalities that perhaps we can no longer write. And you know, this just came, I mean, this is completely out of left field here, but I had a parallel conversation with a former colleague who's retired now about, oh, nobody writes books like Raymond Williams's City and the Country anymore, which is this all-encompassing grand narrative in a way in terms of scholarship. We tend to focus in on the smaller bits, on the fragments, on the little histories, but still making grander claims about it, looking for patterns, looking for forms, looking for the larger picture in a way. So I think this is my own insecurity at the moment, and my question to all of you, how we deal with these larger claims and the grander narratives. I don't know whether anybody wants to jump in here, or whether grand narratives are simply dead and should be.
Of course, we'll let the panel go first, but if anyone else wants to jump in the audience and try to work through Julia's question, that is open as well, of course. You don't have to just ask questions, you can provide answers.
I love your question, Julia. It seems to me like it seems to me like maybe what connected all our papers was the idea of being putting ourselves in the middle of at intersections, and clearly Jacqueline's focusing on ports. So this idea of entering, but also spaces that are obviously closed in many ways. There was this idea of emotional bonding through literature, the discontinuity in opium experience, and I think it very much looks like following going down a rabbit hole, maybe in many ways. So I struggle also in my writing, because it is about fragments and trying to show that there's a pattern, and maybe the kind of claim we're making, the kind of big assumptions we're making are just different in nature, but I think they're still grand in a way. They're not so much chronological in this idea of seizing time and space in one single narrative, but thematical? Yeah, is that the correct word, right? So I'll say there's still some sort of hubris in it. Maybe there's still hubris in it, but at least it's yeah, at least it's trying to take a different vantage point from what we used to have, maybe a less hyperbolic view. I really appreciate your question. Thanks so much.
Matt also makes a good point in the text chat. Matt says, one important factor with longue durée and scavenging is the socioeconomics of scholarship now. Of course, William and Braudel had tenure, as Williams would be quick to mention, I think. Yeah. I think Wai Lo has a follow-up question to Julia's comment. Do you want to ask it out loud?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so this is really a question that ties in with what we've been discussing so far and what Victor said just now about going down a rabbit hole. So I really like the idea of scavenging. It resonates a lot with the way that I do my research, but at the same time, it also goes against the demand that we specialize in something in academic professionalization. So while I like scavenging and making connections between different things, I often feel like I'm not a specialist and I have to depend a lot on the work of specialists. And yet at the same time, I still feel like I don't know enough about something. So there's always this worry that I've missed something out because I'm too busy trying to make connections across very broad scope, especially if you're working with very broad geographical transnational scope. You always feel like you're missing something out because you're not a specialist in Japan studies or you're a Victorianist. So I was wondering, what kind of difficulties have the panelists faced in using the scavenging method? And what are the ways in which you try to overcome these difficulties?
I'd like to just take that up a little bit because I'm in the middle of writing my way through those difficulties. And I think, I mean, just like there's like the archive fever, there's all these like sorts of like metaphors for rabbit hole, for the things that we do, you know, in terms of like, to, I guess, maybe bat away that sense of, oh, what's my authority to say something, you know, or to write something. And I think that's part of what's and I guess, so that's one thought I have, is to recognize that part of what I'm doing is answering an anxiety of giving myself grounds to which to say something. And once that's out of the way, I feel like, well, I have something to say, and I'm finding the archive and in order to say it. And so, and part of I think, to say that what we're trying to do right now is also an imaginative endeavor, like to propose maybe because grand narrative has such a bad connotation, or a construct, a kind of a cognitive map, or is what I'm thinking about with Jameson's term, like some kind of whole. For me, it's this notion of what if London was a Pacific Rim city, just this kind of weird thought, and then try to create out of that. So this is coming obviously from work with like Saidiya Hartman, different kinds of scholars who deal with missing archives, broken archives, absences in archives. So that's part of negotiating. I think the difficulty is kind of owning the fact that there's this construct that's there, and that you're trying to, obviously it's not going to be, there's no one who's an expert in that except you, who's kind of putting it together. So that's one thought I had. And then the other is just a quick anecdote, because I remember when I had an advisor a long time ago, and I was trying to learn every single theory to try to have a kind of holistic conceptual, so everything can fit together in one map, and he had, I think it was a throwaway comment, and he said, having a grand theory is impossible, but the desire to get one is actually commendable, or something to that effect. So, so that in-between space, of being simultaneously in the fragment and in the whole, I think is sort of like where we're at. Yeah. Two thoughts.
Thank you so much for the question, Wei, and also wonderful answer, Jacqueline. And I also share that sentiment of not specialist enough for everything, and I totally understand that. And one way I think for me to address that fear is to think academia as a community rather than a competitive place, and we have to specialize in everything in this competitive job market. So no one single scholar can do everything. So I'm trying to clarify my contribution as a Japanese scholar who can read Japanese, and then I try to offer my findings to the academic community so that we can all together think about that question. And also I also shared this scavenging method in a way that I'm looking at these paradiplomatic activities by women, which are not well documented. So I constantly contact some relatives of those Japanese politicians, or Japanese person, and begging them whether they have anything interesting for me to read. So but without this kind of effort, those documents will be forever lost. So that might be another contribution, I hope. But yeah, it's sometimes most of the time it's really difficult to justify my research and to claim the worth of its worth. But that's my thought.
And Jessica Medhurst added to this conversation. She said, as Matt's comment illuminated to me, producing such narratives is part of the power structure that we're critiquing here. A rejection of grand narratives is a rejection of being the authority, and instead replacing an emphasis on collaboration, as well as giving space to apparently small or overlooked areas, identities, perspectives. I think that's really well said. And Jack has a question. He said, thank you, Menglu, for your wonderful presentation. I really learned a lot from it. A small question: the intertextuality between Charles Gutzlaff's texts and other English texts is prominent in your research. Is there a linkage between them and contemporaneous Chinese texts as well?
Yeah, I do write about a connection between the idea of intoxication in Gutzlaff and Linze Xu's letter to Queen Victoria. So it was translated into English as well, but it was originally written in Chinese. The point here is that he's emphasizing how the importation of opium was sort of leading the Chinese people to focus too much on amusement rather than their daily routine. So I think that there's definitely a sense of lack of productivity rather than his emphasis on the drug being poisonous in the letter. So he doesn't actually specify how the poisonous or harmful effects the drug actually brings to the Chinese people. But the point about providing a sort of distraction or having this amusement for nothing beneficial is really very prominent in this letter. So I'm actually thinking about that together with the discussion of productive English tax. If we think about the transportation of opium as a post-industrial revolution thing, it's definitely something that you can think about together with like the earlier status of drunkenness that is a kind of interruption of this capitalist measurement of time. And I think Lin's letter actually says something about that as well, because he's kind of thinking about that in relation to people's productivity or the idea of amusement. So I definitely think there are a lot of connections between that, especially Chinese texts focusing on the idea of fallenness and amusement. And I think they are all to some extent relevant to the idea of time. And also actually Gutzlaff himself actually writes Chinese novels in Chinese because his identity as a missionary. So he writes about stories about people using opium and somehow like gets fallen and kind of sort of like stop from like the original path of self-development of progress. So I guess on the individual level, it's also something relevant to progress and development if we think about opium. I hope that partially answered the question.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. I think that's enough time for one, maybe two questions. Does anyone have a final question?
I have maybe a question for my fellow panelists, but also obviously to the public. I think that maybe one way, or at least one way I've tried to write and conduct my research was to rely on different sources than the usual historiography is relying on. And because I have sort of a weird background coming from art history and then jumping into history of science, I started to look at paintings. I started to look at images that maybe scientists or historians of science weren't necessarily looking at interesting images or significant images. So I was just wondering about mediums, the variety of mediums, and if for your researches, did you encounter different types of mediums? Did you have that in mind as a category to approach your own research, or what was your strategy basically in regards to visual, audio, maybe, or literature?
I'm just going to say one thing. It's not about what I want. Well, it's about what I didn't do. I had written Jessica that I'm going to do this thing and I want to write a radio play with what I found. And I didn't do that. So, but so it's less about like, so it's not about like finding different mediums, but also the question about like, how could we, what are the alternative forms for knowledge production as scholars, and how can we translate the work we do into other mediums? So it's not really an answer to the question, but something that I have been playing around with. It's part of the work that I do with the Urban Humanities Initiative at UCLA is, it's a consortium that brings together urban planners and designers, and the design field is always thinking about speculative kind of imaginative outputs for the knowledge that they're given. So part of it is like, what can we make out, what other mediums can we translate the work into? So that doesn't really answer your question, but it is, I do have a question still about transmedium work and how, and I think that matters because that's the world we live in too. And actually that's a Victorian world too, actually. So this kind of like, moving between multiple ways and forms of understanding things. So part of what I think one way to do that is to maybe practice it ourselves, and try to make things that are kind of multimedia.
And you kind of gesture at that with the way that you structured, even though it was a traditional academic talk, you still had like the act 1, act 2, and so you're alluding to other forms.
Yeah, I still want to play around with it because I'm wondering what we could do. I mean, because part of it was like dealing with the language issue, and I was thinking what would be great, like in collaboration, like what if I got people together that could work together, produce this radio play that I had in mind, and so just kind of like thinking about different forms. But I certainly cheated at it with the forms rather than the actually delivering it to you.
I think my answer to your question, Victor, is that it's not really intellectual or anything. It's more like practical. But for our research, we can't really work on one thing forever. So I think about the main argument I want to make through the materials I love the most, and then I kind of try to shift out those interesting but not really relevant, and also because I'm working on English literature, like in the field of English literary studies. So that's also helps me to focus my research, I think, if that makes any sense.
And I just want to sneak in one last question, and then we'll end. So I guess just a couple of minutes late, but I realized that we hadn't gone back to Jacqueline's questions at the beginning, but she did ask perhaps a good question to close. Jacqueline asked, how should present day global emergencies inform the work of conceiving 19th century global imaginaries? And I think this builds on a lot of the things we've been discussing, the ways in which our work might be presentist or might be responding to or grappling with issues that are ongoing, or perhaps things that are personal even for ourselves. I know my own current research is very much informed being an American positioned in Hong Kong teaching British literature. So I guess I'll open up that last question that Jacqueline posed at the beginning, and then we'll close our discussion. So just to remind you, how should present day global emergencies or events inform the work of conceiving 19th century global imaginaries?
I can jump in because so to me it's it's quite obvious for me that the rise of the idea of the Anthropocene, this narrative, this geological narrative that we're trying to rebuild about the humanity as a whole, is obviously at the core of my research, trying to show that the construction of the deep past of archaeological remains is political in itself and has been political. And therefore, when we have a discourse like the Anthropocene, it draws on this yet unknown tradition of political meaning that that exists with the fossil remains. So I think I would totally agree with Jacqueline that there is this element, this urgency in my research in how I try to approach the history of 19th century paleontology. But at the same time, I really try to forget about it. First, I thought I was going to write something very much like into it and saying like, there's the Anthropocene, it's scary, like, but we need to look at it differently. And now I'm trying to just like leave it out the door when I do my research, and maybe leave it just as a sort of maybe a little music that people are going to hear when they're reading me. So I struggle with this idea of presentism. But I think it's definitely there. But I try to leave it at the door, and I think it's going to sneak in on its own anyway. So, but yeah, great question. Thank you.
And I guess we have time for one more response, if anyone wants to say anything.
I just have like a very quick comment. I still see, I mean, as someone who's thinking about like how Britain and China representing each other in the 19th century, I definitely see this kind of continuity of that rhetoric, especially starting from last year when I see Chinese media talking about like coronavirus in the West as well as the other way around. And I mean, unfortunately, I feel like this kind of stereotypical information still exists in the present. So I think I might see like the history is like echoed right now, but the current framework or like the format of seeing like the representation of the other is sort of developing in our present world is also sort of like like kind of inspiring me to think about this kind of structure in the 19th century. So I guess that's like one of the observation we can still see today.
Thank you so much for 4 really amazing papers. I enjoyed listening to them and learned so much. And I think we had a good conversation as well. I want to remind everyone that the next session, if you're able to make it, is April 15th, but a different time, 12 hours difference. So unfortunately, I'm sorry for those of you in California, it would be an awkward time, but it will be April 15th at 9 p.m. Hong Kong time and April 15th, 9 a.m. US Eastern time. But I just want to do a final round of applause for everyone. Thank you. And I look forward to seeing some of you at the next event, and I'll also just keeping in touch with everyone in other ways. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.